The first real crack in my marriage came on an ordinary Saturday afternoon, when Emily walked into our house smelling like she had bathed in a stranger's cologne. It wasn't the usual faint trace of perfume mixed with her natural scent, it was heavy, thick, almost suffocating. The kind of smell that clung to someone who had been pressed up against another body for too long. I was sitting at the dining table, half listening to a podcast while going through some emails, when she walked in. She was wearing that gray dress I always told her made her look incredible, the one she rarely wore because she claimed it was too dressy for everyday stuff. Her hair, usually neat and styled, looked slightly messy, and not in the windblown, casual way. More like someone had run their fingers through it, tugged at it, held it. I looked up from my laptop, taking in the way she hesitated at the door, the way her eyes flickered to me before quickly shifting away, as if checking whether I had noticed something. I had. But I played dumb. That's what you do when you don't want to believe something terrible. "Hey," I said, keeping my voice even. "You were gone a while. Where'd you go?" She hesitated just for a second, but a second was all I needed. I had known Emily for a decade, knew the way she breathed when she was nervous, the way she shifted her weight from foot to foot when she was about to lie. She smiled, walking over to the kitchen counter and placing down a bag of groceries. "I stopped by the mall after running errands," she said, pulling out a carton of milk and placing it in the fridge. "Got a few things for the house." "The mall?" "We never shopped at the mall." She hated it, always said the crowds were annoying, the stores overpriced. I glanced at the bag she had set down. The only thing inside was the milk and a bottle of cheap red wine. That wasn't a few things. That was just enough to make it look like she had actually gone shopping. "Must have been crowded today," I said, standing up and walking toward her, trying to keep my voice casual. "Took you almost 3 hours. She let out a small laugh, but it was too forced, too airy. "Yeah, you know how it is. I got stuck in a long checkout line. And then traffic on the way back was a nightmare." There was no traffic. I had been out earlier, picking up some takeout, and the roads had been practically empty. I stepped closer, just enough to get a better look at her. That smell was stronger now, almost intoxicating. It wasn't just cologne, it was sweat, mixed with something else, something unmistakable. My stomach clenched, but I forced myself to act normal. "Emily," I said, my voice lower now. "Come here for a second." She froze for half a beat, then turned to me, smiling. "What's up?" I reached out, tucking a strand of hair behind her ear, letting my fingers brush against her skin. She flinched barely, but enough for me to notice. "You smell different," I murmured, watching her expression carefully. She blinked, then laughed, too quickly. "Oh, I tried a new perfume at the mall," she said, waving a hand dismissively. "One of those samples they give out. Guess it stuck to me more than I thought." "A sample?" That was the best she could come up with? I exhaled slowly, my heart pounding in my chest. My mind raced through possibilities. Maybe I was overthinking it. Maybe I was being paranoid. Maybe she really had just gone shopping, tried on a perfume, and gotten caught in some imaginary traffic. But then she did something that made my blood run cold. She reached into her purse and pulled out her phone, swiping at the screen before shoving it back inside as if nothing had happened. But I caught it, I saw the way she deleted something, her thumb moving too quickly, too practiced. She had erased something the second she walked in. I didn't say anything. Not yet. Instead, I stepped back, nodded, and forced a small smile. "Yeah, makes sense," I said, pretending to drop it. She let out a breath, relieved. That relief alone told me everything I needed to know. She thought I had bought it. That night, I barely slept. I lay awake next to her, staring at the ceiling, my mind running through every detail, every inconsistency in her story. The cologne. The long hours. The shopping that didn't make sense. The phone. Something was wrong. And I was going to find out what. Let me know when you're ready for the next part. The next morning, I forced myself out of bed earlier than usual, my body heavy from the weight of my thoughts. Emily was still asleep, her back turned to me, breathing softly like she didn't have a single worry in the world. I sat at the edge of the bed for a moment, running my hands down my face, trying to push back the anger threatening to boil over. My mind was stuck on yesterday, on the way she had walked through the door, on the smell of cologne that wasn't mine, on the way she had deleted something from her phone the second she stepped into the house. Every detail felt like a flashing red light, telling me I had been blind for too long. I had to stop pretending. I needed answers. I stood up, moving carefully to avoid waking her, and slipped out of the bedroom. Once inside the bathroom, I shut the door behind me, turning the lock out of habit. The shower curtain was still damp from the night before, and I caught the faint scent of soap, but underneath it, there was something else. That same cologne, lingering in the fabric of the clothes she had tossed in the hamper. My hands tightened into fists at my sides before I forced myself to take a breath. Getting angry wouldn't get me anywhere. I needed to think. I crouched down, lifting the gray dress she had been wearing yesterday. I held it up, turning it over in my hands, looking for anything out of place. It wasn't just the cologne, there were subtle things, creases in the fabric that shouldn't have been there, the faintest smudge on the hem. I brought it closer to my nose, inhaling carefully, and felt my stomach twist. Sweat, mixed with something heavier, something unmistakable. I yanked the dress away from my face like it had burned me. My hands clenched around the fabric, and for a split second, I wanted to tear it apart, rip it into useless shreds until there was nothing left of it. But I stopped myself. Evidence. That's what this was. I forced myself to place the dress back in the hamper exactly as I had found it, washing my hands under the cold water, watching the way my fingers trembled slightly. When I looked up at my reflection in the mirror, my own face looked different to me. My jaw was locked tight, my eyes dark with something I hadn't felt in years. I wasn't the type of man who liked playing games, who liked sneaking around and gathering clues like I was in some shitty detective movie. But if Emily was lying to me, if she had done what I was starting to think she had done, then I wasn't going to confront her without proof. I left the bathroom, walking quietly back into the bedroom. She was still asleep, her body half tangled in the sheets. I stood there for a moment, watching her, trying to see if I could recognize the woman I had married in the person in front of me. But all I could think about was yesterday, about the way she had hesitated at the door, about the way she had smelled like another man, about the way she had deleted something from her phone before even saying hello to me. I grabbed my phone off the nightstand and left the room. Once I was in the kitchen, I sat down at the table, staring at my phone, running through everything in my head. If she was cheating, if she was seeing someone else, then she had to be meeting them somewhere. And that meant there had to be a pattern, a location, a time. I couldn't just sit around and wait for another lie. I needed something solid, something that would tell me exactly where she was going when she wasn't with me. Then I remembered the GPS tracker. A few months ago, after someone hit my car in a parking lot and took off, I had bought a small, magnetic tracker that could be monitored through an app. It was meant for security, for peace of mind, but now I realized it could give me exactly what I needed. If I attached it to Emily's car, I could track her movements in real time. No more guessing, no more doubts. I got up and headed to the garage. The tracker was still in the box where I had left it, tucked away with some other electronics I had barely touched in months. I pulled it out, checked the battery, and charged it for a few minutes while I stared out the window, my thoughts a tangled mess. Part of me still wanted to believe there was another explanation, that I was reading too much into things, but deep down, I knew better. Once the tracker was charged, I slipped outside. Emily's car was parked in the driveway, same as always. The morning air was cool against my skin, the neighborhood still quiet. I crouched down near the back bumper, pressing the tracker against the metal. It clicked into place, completely hidden from view. Just as I stood up, the front door opened. "Hey," Emily called out, stepping outside in her robe, rubbing her eyes like she had just woken up. "What are you doing out here?" I turned around, keeping my expression neutral. "Thought I left something in my car," I said, patting my pockets for effect. "Guess not." She smiled, but it was tight, distracted. "You were up early." "Couldn't sleep," I replied, shrugging like it was nothing. She stepped closer, wrapping her arms around my waist, pressing her face against my chest. "You okay?" I hesitated for a second before forcing myself to wrap my arms around her, letting my chin rest against the top of her head. "Yeah," I said. "Just tired." She pulled back slightly, looking up at me with something unreadable in her expression. "Maybe we should do something together today. Go out, get some fresh air." I studied her face, trying to figure out if this was guilt or if she was just trying to cover her tracks. "Yeah," I said. "That sounds good." She kissed me lightly before heading back inside. I watched her go, my mind already racing. If she really wanted to spend the day with me, that meant whoever she had been with yesterday wasn't expecting to see her today. Which meant that yesterday wasn't random, it was planned. And if it was planned, then it could happen again. I pulled out my phone, opened the tracker app, and watched as it connected to her car. Now all I had to do was wait. Emily spent most of the morning acting normal, or at least trying to. She made coffee, scrolled through her phone at the kitchen table, asked me if I wanted to go out for lunch later. I played along, pretending to consider it, pretending that everything was fine, pretending that I wasn't counting down the minutes until she left the house so I could track exactly where she was going. I told her I had a few things to finish up for work and that we could decide later. She smiled like she was relieved, like she had been worried I might actually take her up on the offer. That small detail only confirmed what I already knew: she had plans today, and they didn't include me. At around noon, she went upstairs to shower and change. I waited, listening to the sound of the water running, the occasional movement as she moved around the bathroom. When she finally stepped out, I glanced up from my laptop, watching as she walked into the bedroom wrapped in a towel. She didn't close the door all the way, and from where I sat, I could see her flipping through her closet, pulling out outfits, pausing in front of the mirror as she held them up against her body. She was getting ready for something, for someone. She settled on a pair of jeans, a fitted blouse, and those heels she only ever wore on special occasions. Not too dressy, but definitely more effort than she usually put in for a casual afternoon out. She blow-dried her hair, applied a light layer of makeup, sprayed herself with perfume. Not the same scent as yesterday, something lighter, fresher. A calculated change, subtle enough that I might not have noticed if I wasn't paying attention. But I was paying attention now. When she came downstairs, she grabbed her purse, smiled at me, and said, "I think I'll run a few errands, maybe stop by that little boutique downtown." "You want me to pick up anything while I'm out?" I shook my head, keeping my expression neutral. "No, I'm good." She hesitated for half a second, maybe expecting me to ask more questions, maybe testing to see if I was suspicious. I didn't take the bait. She leaned down, kissed me on the cheek, and headed for the door. I waited exactly 1 minute after I heard her car pull out of the driveway before I opened the tracker app on my phone. Her location popped up instantly, a small blue dot moving along the map. At first, she followed the usual route, heading toward downtown like she had said. I kept watching, waiting for the moment she would veer off, waiting for the moment she would give herself away. Sure enough, after about 10 minutes, she took an unexpected turn. Not toward the boutique she mentioned, not toward the grocery store or anywhere else she usually went. Instead, she drove toward the other side of town, a quiet area with office buildings and hotels. I grabbed my keys, my pulse quickening as I followed the tracker's movement on my screen. I told myself to stay calm, to think logically. Maybe there was another explanation, maybe this was nothing, maybe I was about to feel like the biggest asshole in the world for doubting her. But deep down, I knew. I had known since yesterday. I just needed to see it for myself. I got in my car and started driving, keeping an eye on the tracker. She stopped in a parking lot outside a small, nondescript office building. Not the kind of place with high traffic, not the kind of place she had any reason to be. I parked a block away, far enough that she wouldn't notice me, close enough that I could still keep an eye on the entrance. And then I saw her. She got out of the car, adjusting her blouse, running a hand through her hair like she was nervous. She checked her phone, then looked around, as if making sure no one was watching. My grip tightened on the steering wheel as I watched her walk toward the entrance, disappearing inside the building. For a few minutes, I just sat there, my heartbeat loud in my ears, my mind racing through 1,000 possibilities. I needed to know what she was doing in there, who she was meeting, why she had lied to me. I got out of my car and walked toward the building. The building wasn't anything special, just a plain office space with tinted windows and a glass door. There was no sign out front, no clear indication of what kind of business operated inside. I walked up to the entrance and peered through the glass, scanning the small lobby. It was empty except for a receptionist sitting behind a desk, tapping at a keyboard. She barely looked up as I pulled the door open and stepped inside. The air was cool, carrying the sterile scent of printer ink and old carpet. A few chairs lined the walls, but there were no other visitors waiting. I walked up to the desk, forcing my expression to stay neutral. "Hey," I said casually, leaning slightly forward. "I think my wife is here. She just got in a few minutes ago, long brown hair, wearing a blue blouse. I was supposed to meet her, but I forgot which office she said she'd be in." The receptionist barely glanced at me, still focused on whatever she was typing. "Do you have an appointment?" "No," I said, keeping my voice relaxed, like I wasn't already feeling the weight of every possibility crashing down on me. "She didn't tell me I needed one. She just said to come find her when I got here." She sighed and finally looked up. "What's her name?" "Emily." She frowned slightly, then glanced at a clipboard. "Emily Parker?" Hearing her name spoken out loud in a place I knew she wasn't supposed to be sent a fresh wave of nausea rolling through me. I nodded, keeping my face neutral. "She's already inside," the receptionist said, tapping a pen against the clipboard. "She's with Mr. Dalton in his office. Do you need me to let her know you're here?" "Mr. Dalton." I didn't recognize the name. It wasn't anyone from her office, wasn't anyone she had ever mentioned in conversation. If it was a work meeting, why would she lie about it? And if it wasn't a work meeting, then what the hell was she doing here? "No, that's fine," I said, swallowing the bitterness rising in my throat. "I'll wait." The receptionist nodded and went back to typing, clearly uninterested in whatever was happening between me and my wife. I turned away from the desk, taking slow steps toward the chairs against the wall. My mind was racing, but I needed to think. If I pushed too hard, if I walked straight through that door and confronted her without proof, she'd have an excuse, a story, a reason to twist the situation into something that wasn't my worst fear. I needed to see it with my own eyes. I sat down, forcing myself to breathe slowly. The door leading to the offices was only a few feet away, slightly ajar. If I timed it right, I could slip in unnoticed. I watched the receptionist, waiting for the moment when she was distracted, when she glanced down at her phone, when she turned slightly in her chair. The second it happened, I moved. The hallway beyond the door was narrow and quiet, lined with offices on either side. Most had their doors closed, but one at the end was slightly open. I moved quickly, keeping my steps light, my heart pounding so hard I was sure it would give me away. As I got closer, I heard voices. A man's voice, low, smooth, confident. Then Emily's, softer, nervous. I reached the door and positioned myself just outside the line of sight. I could hear them clearly now. "I missed you," the man said, his tone casual, like this wasn't the first time he had said it. Emily let out a quiet laugh, but it was forced. "It hasn't been that long." "Long enough?" There was a pause, a shift in the air, a silence that was heavier than it should have been. "You shouldn't say things like that," Emily said, her voice lower now. "Why not?" "Because," another pause. "You know why." I clenched my fists at my sides, every muscle in my body tensed, every instinct screaming at me to burst through the door and demand answers. But I stayed put, forcing myself to wait, forcing myself to listen. "I don't care," the man said, and there was a rustling sound, movement. "You know I don't." Emily sighed. "I told you, it's not that simple." Another silence. Another pause where the weight of their words filled the room. Then, the sound of footsteps. I moved back, pressing myself against the wall just as the door opened fully. I saw him first, tall, well-dressed, maybe in his early 40s. He had the kind of confidence that only came with getting exactly what you wanted. And right behind him was Emily, her face flushed, her hands adjusting the hem of her blouse like she was trying to fix something that had already gone wrong.
They didn't see me. Not yet.
The man smiled at her, lowering his voice.
Next time, don't make me wait so long.
Emily shook her head, but she was smiling too, small, hesitant, but there.
She wasn't pulling away.
She wasn't telling him to stop.
That was all I needed to see. I stepped forward. Emily's smile froze the second she saw me.
Her whole body went rigid, her fingers tightening around the strap of her purse like she suddenly needed something to hold on to. The man, Mr. Dalton, I assumed, turned his head toward me, his expression shifting from casual amusement to mild curiosity.
He didn't look guilty. He didn't look nervous. He looked like a man who had nothing to be afraid of, and that alone made my blood boil.
I took a step forward, my eyes locked on Emily, waiting for her to say something, to explain, to even attempt to lie her way out of whatever the hell I had just witnessed. But for a long moment, she just stared at me, her face pale, her lips slightly parted, like she couldn't believe I was standing there. Finally, she swallowed hard and forced out a weak laugh.
"What are you doing here?"
That was her first instinct, to pretend this was normal, to act like I was the one who needed to explain himself. It was such a pathetic attempt at control that I almost laughed in her face. Instead, I tilted my head slightly, studying her the same way she had studied me last night when she had walked in smelling like another man. "That's a good question," I said slowly, my voice calm in a way that felt unnatural.
"Maybe you can answer it for me."
Dalton shifted slightly, his hands sliding into the pockets of his tailored suit.
"I take it you two know each other?"
I ignored him completely, my focus still on Emily. She licked her lips, glancing between us, probably trying to figure out the best way to spin this. "It's not what it looks like," she said quickly, her voice just a little too breathless. I let out a short breath through my nose, shaking my head slightly.
"You're really going to say that?"
Emily straightened her shoulders, forcing herself to look me in the eye.
"It's not," she said again, this time more firmly. "This is a business meeting. I told you I had errands to run."
I cut her off before she could finish that ridiculous sentence.
"Business meeting?" I repeated, letting the words hang in the air between us. "That's what you're going with?" Dalton exhaled through his nose, shifting again.
"Listen, I don't know what's going on between you two, but..." I snapped my head toward him, my patience already gone. "Stay out of this," I said, my voice sharp enough to make his mouth press into a thin line.
"You've already said enough."
He didn't move, but I could see the way his jaw clenched, the way his shoulders tensed.
I didn't care. He wasn't my problem.
Emily let out a shaky breath, her fingers still gripping her purse strap like it was the only thing keeping her upright. "We should talk about this at home," she said, her voice quieter now.
"Not here." I let out a bitter laugh. "Now you care about where we have this conversation."
I took another step forward, lowering my voice but making sure she heard every word. "You didn't seem too worried about privacy when you were in there with him."
Emily's face flushed. "Nothing happened." I raised an eyebrow. "Really?"
"Yes," she snapped, some of her usual fire returning now that she felt backed into a corner.
"I came here because..." I didn't let her finish. "Because you missed him?"
I said, throwing her own words back at her.
"Because it hasn't been that long, but long enough?"
Her mouth opened slightly, but no words came out. She looked completely blindsided, like she had no idea how I could possibly know what had just been said behind that office door. Dalton finally decided to speak again, his tone clipped. "Look, man, I don't know what you think is happening here, but I don't appreciate you making a scene in my office." I turned my head toward him, my voice dangerously even.
"You don't appreciate me making a scene?" I let out a humorless laugh.
"That's interesting, because I don't appreciate my wife sneaking around with someone who thinks he can say whatever he wants to a married woman." Emily grabbed my arm suddenly, her fingers wrapping around my wrist in a desperate attempt to stop this from escalating. "Let's just go," she whispered, her eyes darting around like she was afraid someone might walk out and see this. I looked down at her hand on my arm, then back up at her face.
"Why?" I asked, my voice low. "So you can keep lying? So you can try to come up with some bullshit excuse on the drive home?"
Her grip tightened for half a second before she let go, taking a small step back.
"I don't know what you want me to say," she said, her voice unsteady now.
I stared at her, my anger simmering just beneath the surface.
"I want the truth."
For a moment, she said nothing.
Then, finally, she let out a shaky breath and looked away. "Can we just go home?" I didn't answer right away.
I just stood there, watching her, letting the silence stretch out between us.
Finally, I nodded once. "Fine."
Without another word, I turned on my heel and walked toward the exit, not bothering to check if she was following. The drive home was silent, thick with tension so heavy it felt like the car itself was suffocating under it. Emily sat with her arms crossed, her gaze locked on the window like she could pretend this wasn't happening if she just refused to look at me. I gripped the wheel tighter, my knuckles white, forcing myself to stay calm, to focus on the road instead of the 100 things I wanted to say.
She wanted to talk at home. Fine. She would talk.
As soon as we pulled into the driveway, she reached for the door handle like she couldn't get out of the car fast enough. I killed the engine and followed, slamming the door behind me as I walked toward the house. She was already inside by the time I reached the door, pacing near the couch, rubbing her arms like she was cold. I shut the door and turned to face her, crossing my arms as I leaned back against it.
"Start talking." She let out a breath, shaking her head. "I don't even know where to start."
I scoffed, pushing off the door.
"Try the truth. That usually works."
Her eyes snapped to mine, and for the first time since I had caught her, I saw real frustration there, mixed with something else, guilt, maybe. "Nothing happened," she said, her voice firm.
"I know how it looked,
I know what you think you heard, but it's not what you're making it out to be." I let out a short laugh, nodding slowly.
"Right. Because when a married woman sneaks off to meet a man in private, tells him she misses him and it hasn't been that long but long enough, that's just casual conversation?"
She flinched at her own words being thrown back at her, her lips parting like she was going to deny it, but she didn't. Instead, she let out a shaky sigh and ran a hand through her hair.
"It's not an affair." I tilted my head. "So what is it?" She hesitated. That hesitation told me more than anything else.
If it was really nothing, she wouldn't need to think about her answer. She wouldn't need to carefully choose her words like she was trying to find the least incriminating way to phrase them.
Finally, she exhaled and looked away. "We used to date."
I blinked, caught off guard for the first time since this started.
"What?"
"Years ago," she said quickly, like that somehow made it better.
"Before I met you." It wasn't serious.
We were together for a few months, but it ended, and I hadn't talked to him in years. I stared at her, my mind running through every possible angle.
"And now, suddenly, you're seeing him again?"
She bit her lip, crossing her arms tighter.
"He reached out a few months ago.
Said he wanted to reconnect, just as friends."
I didn't think anything of it."
"You didn't think anything of it," I repeated slowly, letting the words sink in.
"So you lied about where you were going? You deleted messages from your phone? You snuck around because you didn't think anything of it?"
She swallowed hard, looking at the floor.
"I didn't want you to get the wrong idea." I let out a humorless laugh, shaking my head. "The wrong idea?"
"Emily, the only reason I know about any of this is because you were careless. You deleted things, but not fast enough. You lied, but not well enough.
If I hadn't caught you, would you have ever told me?" She didn't answer. That was my answer.
I stepped closer, my voice lower now.
"Are you in love with him?"
Her head snapped up, her eyes wide.
"What?" "No."
"Have you slept with him?" Her face twisted with offense.
"No."
I stared at her, searching her expression for any sign that she was lying.
"Have you kissed him?"
She opened her mouth, then closed it.
That hesitation again. My stomach twisted, my fists clenching at my sides. "Emily," I said slowly. "Did you kiss him?" She let out a slow breath, looking at the floor. "It wasn't."
"I swear to God, if you say it wasn't like that, I will walk out of this house right now." She snapped her mouth shut, her face pale. I took a step back, running a hand down my face.
How long? She hesitated again. I was so sick of that hesitation. Emily, I snapped. 3 months, she whispered. I let out a sharp breath, nodding to myself. 3 months.
So while I've been here, thinking everything was fine, you've been sneaking off to see your ex, deleting messages, kissing him.
She winced but didn't argue. I clenched my jaw. Why?
She let out a shaky breath, wrapping her arms around herself.
I don't know. Bullshit.
She flinched but didn't deny it. I shook my head, stepping back toward the door.
I need to think.
She took a step forward.
Please don't leave. I looked at her, really looked at her. Give me one good reason to stay.
She opened her mouth, but no words came out.
I nodded once. That's what I thought. Then I walked out. I didn't go far.
I walked out of the house, down the driveway, and stood by my car with my hands on my hips, staring at nothing. My mind was racing, playing back every conversation, every excuse Emily had given me over the past 3 months.
I should have noticed sooner. I should have realized that the extra time she spent getting ready, the sudden interest in going out alone, the distant way she had been acting, weren't just random changes. I had ignored the signs because I hadn't wanted to believe that the woman I married was capable of betraying me. But now, I didn't have the luxury of pretending anymore. The front door creaked open behind me, and I knew without looking that it was Emily. I could hear her hesitant steps as she walked toward me, stopping just a few feet away. For a moment, neither of us spoke. The quiet stretched between us, thick and suffocating. "Where did you go?" she finally asked, her voice careful, like she wasn't sure what version of me she was going to get right now. I exhaled sharply through my nose and turned to face her. I just needed air. Her arms were wrapped around herself, her shoulders hunched slightly like she was bracing for whatever came next. "Are you coming back inside?" I tilted my head, studying her, trying to figure out what she was thinking. "Do you want me to?" She swallowed, her gaze flickering to the ground for a second before meeting mine again. "Yes." I let out a humorless chuckle. "Because you don't want to be alone, or because you actually want to fix this?" Her lips parted slightly, but she didn't answer right away. That hesitation was becoming all too familiar. "Emily." She shifted on her feet, exhaling. "I don't want to lose you." I narrowed my eyes. "That's not an answer." She let out a small, frustrated breath. "What do you want me to say?" I took a slow step toward her, lowering my voice. "I want you to tell me why. Why you did this. Why you let this happen. Why you threw away 12 years of marriage for a man you haven't seen in years." She squeezed her arms tighter around herself, her jaw clenching. "I don't have a simple answer for that." I let out a sharp laugh. "Try anyway." She was quiet for a long moment, then finally, she spoke. "I didn't plan for this. I wasn't looking for it." He reached out, and I responded. It started as just catching up. Talking. Remembering old times. And then it shifted. I stared at her, my chest tightening. "Shifted," I repeated. "That's a nice way of saying you started sneaking around with him behind my back." She winced but didn't argue. I ran a hand through my hair, shaking my head. "So what now? You said you don't want to lose me, but I don't even know what that means. Do you want me, or do you just not want to deal with the consequences of what you've done?" She sucked in a breath, her fingers digging into her arms. "I want you." I studied her, trying to figure out if she actually meant it or if she was just grasping for the safest option now that she had been caught. "Do you still have feelings for him?" Her face twisted in frustration. "It's not that simple." "It is," I shot back. "Either you do, or you don't." Her breath hitched slightly, and for the first time, I saw real fear in her eyes. "I don't know," she admitted quietly. I clenched my jaw, stepping back like I had been physically shoved. Jesus, Emily.
She reached out instinctively, like she wanted to take it back, like she realized too late that honesty was the worst thing she could have given me right now.
That's not what I meant.
Yes, it is, I interrupted, my voice flat.
You don't know.
Which means that even after everything, even after you've been caught, even after I'm standing right here asking you to choose, you still can't say it. She was breathing heavily now, her eyes glossy with unshed tears.
It's not about choosing. I laughed bitterly. That's exactly what this is about. You had a choice 3 months ago, and you made it. Now, I have to make mine.
She looked at me, her expression breaking slightly.
You don't have to decide right now. I exhaled slowly, shaking my head. I think I already have. Her lips trembled.
Steve, please. I turned away, walking back toward the house. Not because I was giving in, not because I was forgiving her, but because I needed time. Time to figure out how to untangle my life from someone who had already let go of me months ago. I walked back inside without another word, barely aware of Emily following a few steps behind me. The house was quiet except for the soft sound of her breathing, uneven, like she was bracing herself for whatever came next.
I didn't look at her.
I didn't want to see whatever expression she had on her face right now, whether it was guilt, regret, or some desperate attempt at looking innocent.
It didn't matter.
Nothing she could say or do now would change the fact that she had already destroyed everything. I stopped in the living room, my hands resting on my hips as I took in the space around me. It was the same house I had walked into 1,000 times before, the same walls, the same furniture, the same framed photos of us on the shelves. But it felt foreign now, like I was standing in someone else's life, looking at a version of myself who still believed in the woman standing behind me. The weight of it pressed down on me, heavy and suffocating, making it harder to think, harder to breathe. Emily stood near the doorway, her arms wrapped tightly around herself, her fingers digging into the fabric of her sleeves. She was waiting for me to say something, waiting for me to give her a chance to fix this, but I wasn't interested in making this easy for her. I wanted her to sit in the silence, to feel the crushing weight of everything she had done, to understand that this wasn't something a simple apology could undo. "Are you going to leave?" she finally asked, her voice quiet but steady, like she was trying to keep her emotions in check.
I didn't answer right away.
Instead, I let the question settle between us, let the possibility of me walking away sink into her mind the same way it had been sinking into mine since the moment I saw her with him. "I don't know," I said finally, my voice sounding unfamiliar even to my own ears. She exhaled shakily, shifting on her feet like she wanted to move closer but wasn't sure if she should.
"I don't want you to."
I let out a slow breath, shaking my head slightly.
"You should have thought about that 3 months ago."
Her lips pressed together, her arms tightening around herself as she took a hesitant step toward me.
"I never wanted to hurt you."
I turned my head slightly, just enough to look at her, and let out a bitter laugh.
"Yeah? Well, congratulations. You did." She flinched, but she didn't look away. "I was stupid."
I scoffed, crossing my arms over my chest.
"No, you weren't. You knew exactly what you were doing."
She let out a frustrated breath, rubbing at her temples like she was trying to collect her thoughts.
"I wasn't thinking." I narrowed my eyes. "You weren't thinking the first time you texted him? The first time you met up with him? The first time you kissed him?"
I took a slow step closer, lowering my voice.
"You weren't thinking when you lied to my face, over and over again?" Her breath hitched slightly, and for a second, I saw something in her expression that almost looked like shame. "I don't have an excuse." I exhaled sharply, nodding. "At least we can agree on that."
She swallowed hard, her gaze darting away like she couldn't stand to look at me anymore.
"But it didn't mean anything."
I laughed again, the sound harsh and humorless.
"That's supposed to make me feel better?"
Her eyes snapped back to mine.
"I don't know what you want me to say."
I took another step forward, closing the distance between us.
"I want you to tell me the truth."
She hesitated, and that hesitation was all the confirmation I needed. I let out a slow breath, my chest tightening.
"If I hadn't caught you, how long would this have gone on?"
her hands clenched into fists at her sides.
I don't know. I clenched my jaw, shaking my head. That's not an answer.
She exhaled sharply, her voice rising slightly.
I don't know, okay? I don't know what would have happened.
I stared at her, feeling a cold emptiness settle in my stomach.
Yeah, you do. You just don't want to say it.
Her face twisted with frustration.
What do you want from me? I stepped back, running a hand over my face. I want to understand.
I want to know why you threw everything away for some guy you haven't seen in years. Her shoulders slumped, and for the first time, she looked exhausted, like she was just as drained by this conversation as I was.
I don't know, she admitted,
her voice barely above a whisper.
I let out a sharp breath. You keep saying that, but I don't believe you.
She looked up at me, her eyes glossy with unshed tears.
I swear to you, I didn't plan for this. I wasn't looking for it.
I stared at her for a long moment, studying her face, trying to figure out if there was any part of me that still believed her.
Do you love him? I asked finally, my voice steady.
Her breath hitched, and I saw the momentary panic in her eyes.
No.
I tilted my head slightly.
Are you sure?
She swallowed hard.
Yes. Then why did you do it?
Her lips parted slightly, but no words came out.
I shook my head. You can't even answer that, can you?
She exhaled shakily, looking at the floor.
I was selfish. I scoffed. No kidding. She winced but didn't argue.
I turned away from her, staring at the framed wedding photo on the wall.
I don't know if I can come back from this.
Her voice was small, almost fragile.
I'll do anything. I closed my eyes for a second, trying to push down the overwhelming wave of exhaustion crashing over me. Yeah?
I turned back to her, meeting her gaze.
Then give me time. She nodded quickly, like she was relieved that I wasn't walking out the door right then and there.
Of course.
Whatever you need.
I took a slow breath, my voice quieter now.
We'll see.
Then, without another word, I walked past her, leaving her standing in the middle of the room, looking more lost than I had ever seen her. I closed the bedroom door behind me, but it didn't give me the relief I was hoping for. The moment I was alone, the weight of everything settled onto my shoulders like a crushing force, making it impossible to breathe right. My hands were shaking, my pulse still racing from the argument, from the lies, from the realization that my marriage wasn't what I thought it was. I stood in the center of the room, my chest rising and falling heavily, staring at nothing in particular as I tried to make sense of the last few hours. It felt like I had stepped into someone else's life, like this wasn't actually happening to me, like I would wake up any second and everything would be back to normal. But there was no waking up from this. I sat on the edge of the bed, my elbows resting on my knees, fingers tangled in my hair as I let out a slow breath. The room was too quiet, the kind of silence that made my own thoughts louder, sharper. My mind kept replaying everything Emily had said, every excuse, every half-assed attempt at justifying what she had done. She didn't know why she did it. She didn't mean to hurt me. It didn't mean anything. Lies. All of it. If it didn't mean anything, she wouldn't have hidden it. If it didn't mean anything, she wouldn't have deleted messages. If it didn't mean anything, she wouldn't have kissed another man. I squeezed my eyes shut, my fingers pressing hard against my temples as if that would stop the images from flashing in my head. I could still see them, standing close in that office, whispering to each other like I didn't exist. The way she had looked at him. The way she had smiled. That wasn't nothing. That wasn't meaningless. That was my wife with another man, and no matter how many times she said it wasn't what I thought, I knew the truth. I wanted to scream. I wanted to punch a hole in the wall. I wanted to do something, anything, to get this feeling out of my chest. But instead, I just sat there, frozen in place, because none of that would change anything. None of it would undo what she had done. A knock at the door made my jaw clench instantly. I didn't say anything, didn't move, but a second later, the door creaked open, and I knew without looking that it was her. Emily stepped inside hesitantly, her footsteps slow and careful, like she was afraid I might snap the second she got too close. I could feel her watching me, but I refused to look up. I wasn't ready to see whatever expression she was trying to wear now, whether it was guilt, regret, or some pathetic attempt at looking innocent.
"Can we talk?" she asked quietly.
I let out a slow breath, dragging my hands down my face before finally lifting my head to look at her.
"Haven't we done enough of that?"
She swallowed, shifting on her feet.
"I don't want to leave things like this." I scoffed, shaking my head. "Like what?"
She took a deep breath, her arms wrapping around herself as if that would keep her together.
"Like we're strangers." I studied her for a long moment, then let out a bitter laugh. "That's funny, because that's exactly what we are."
Her expression crumbled slightly, but I didn't care. She didn't get to act like she was the one who had been blindsided. "I don't know how to fix this," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper.
I let out a slow breath, nodding. "I don't think you can."
Her lips parted slightly, and for a second, she looked like she might cry.
"I don't want to lose you." I clenched my jaw, staring at her.
"You lost me months ago, Emily."
"You just didn't notice."
She flinched at that, her arms tightening around herself. "I know I don't deserve forgiveness."
I let out another humorless laugh. "That's the first honest thing you've said all night."
She exhaled shakily, her hands dropping to her sides.
"But I still love you." I tilted my head, studying her. If that were true, we wouldn't be having this conversation.
Her breath hitched slightly, and for a moment, she looked completely lost.
"I don't know how to make you believe me." I shook my head slowly. "Maybe because I don't." She took a step closer, but I didn't move. "I'll do whatever it takes."
I stared at her, my chest tight.
"Then give me time."
She hesitated, like she wanted to say something else, but then she just nodded and turned, walking out of the room. The door closed softly behind her, and I was alone again, drowning in the wreckage of everything we had built.
The next morning, I woke up before Emily.
I didn't look at her, didn't check if she was still curled up on her side like she usually was. I just got out of bed, showered, got dressed, and walked out of the bedroom without a word. I wasn't interested in having another conversation that would lead nowhere. I wasn't interested in hearing another apology that meant nothing. I had already made my decision, and now, I just needed to put everything in motion. I sat at the kitchen table, drinking my coffee, staring at my phone as I went through everything I needed to do. The first step was getting my own bank account. Everything we had was shared, and I wasn't about to let her have access to my money once this was over. I transferred my paycheck to a new account, then called the bank to schedule an appointment to separate my finances from hers. Next, I checked the lease on the house. My name was the only one on it, which meant she had no legal claim to stay once I told her to leave. That was good. That made things easier. Emily walked in while I was scrolling through my emails, still wearing her pajamas, her hair slightly messy from sleep. She paused in the doorway, hesitating like she wasn't sure if she should say anything. "Morning," she finally said. I didn't bother looking up. "Morning." She moved toward the coffee maker, pouring herself a cup. "I was thinking maybe we could talk later." I let out a short breath, tapping my finger against the table. "About what?" She shifted slightly, like she was uncomfortable. "About us. About what happens next." I finally looked up, meeting her gaze with a calm expression. "What happens next is simple. You're going to pack your things, and you're going to leave." Her entire body went still. "What?" I leaned back in my chair, tilting my head slightly. "You heard me." Her hands tightened around her coffee mug. "You're kicking me out?" I nodded. "Yeah. I am." She shook her head quickly, taking a step closer. "Steve, please. I told you I would do whatever it takes. Just give me a chance to prove that this was a mistake, that I still want this marriage." I let out a humorless chuckle, rubbing a hand over my face. "A mistake? A mistake is forgetting to pay a bill.
A mistake is buying the wrong kind of milk. What you did was a choice. Repeatedly. And now, I'm making mine.
Tears welled up in her eyes, and she set her coffee down with shaking hands.
You don't mean this.
You're angry, and you're hurt, and I understand that, but please, don't throw everything away. I stared at her for a long moment, then pulled my phone out of my pocket, unlocking the screen before holding it up for her to see.
You recognize this?
She blinked, then looked down at the screen. The color drained from her face instantly. It was a screenshot. A conversation between her and him. The messages she had deleted, thinking I wouldn't be able to recover them. But I did. Her lips parted slightly, but no words came out. I scrolled down slowly, letting her see each line, each message where she had laughed with him, where she had told him she missed him, where she had made plans to meet up with him. And then, finally, I reached the last message. The one that sealed her fate. I can't wait to see you again. It's been too long. She let out a shaky breath. Where did you? I cut her off before she could finish. It doesn't matter. What matters is that you lied. Over and over again. You looked me in the eyes and told me it was just talking, that nothing physical happened. But here you are, making plans for the next time. She took a step back, her entire body trembling now. I was scared. I scoffed. Yeah. Of getting caught. She wiped at her face, shaking her head. Steve, please. I love you. I stood up slowly, slipping my phone back into my pocket. You love the life we built. You love the comfort, the stability. But you don't love me. If you did, we wouldn't be standing here right now. She let out a choked sob, her hands gripping the edge of the counter. Where am I supposed to go? I grabbed my keys from the table and walked toward the door. Not my problem. Then I walked out, leaving her standing there, broken, just like she had left me. I didn't stop walking until I was inside my car, gripping the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles ached. My mind was racing, but there was no regret. Emily deserved this. She had spent months making decisions that tore our marriage apart, and now it was time for her to deal with the consequences. I had spent the last 12 years thinking we were building something real, something unbreakable, and in the span of 3 months, she had thrown it all away for a man she barely knew anymore. She had looked me in the eye, told me she loved me, kissed me goodnight, all while sneaking off behind my back. There was no saving this. There was no coming back from what she had done. I started the car and pulled out of the driveway, my hands steady despite the storm raging inside me. I wasn't going to sit around and listen to her beg. I wasn't going to give her another chance to twist the truth, to manipulate me into thinking that maybe I was overreacting. I had all the proof I needed. The texts, the deleted messages, the lies she had told me straight to my face. There was no room for doubt anymore. Emily had made her choice, and now, I was making mine. I drove with no particular destination in mind, just needing to clear my head, needing to be away from her in the house that no longer felt like home. I passed familiar streets, places we had been together, restaurants where we had shared meals, stores where we had bought things for the life we had built. It all felt like a joke now. Every memory tainted, every good moment overshadowed by the realization that, for months, I had been the only one still living in our marriage. I stopped at a red light, staring at the cars moving past me, people going about their normal lives, oblivious to the fact that mine had just fallen apart. My phone buzzed on the passenger seat, and I glanced down, already knowing who it would be. Emily. The first message was a simple "please pick up." Then another. I need to talk to you. Then a missed call, followed by another text. I'll do anything, just please don't shut me out. I exhaled slowly, gripping the wheel even tighter. She was panicking now, realizing that I wasn't just angry, that this wasn't just a fight we could get past. She thought she could fix this with words, with promises, with whatever version of herself she thought I wanted to see. But there was no fixing this. I reached for my phone, swiped open the messages, and typed out a single response. Pack your things and be gone by tonight. Then I hit send, tossed the phone onto the seat, and drove forward when the light turned green.
I didn't go back to the house right away.
I went to the bank first, making sure everything was in order. I transferred more money into my personal account, one she had no access to, and withdrew enough cash to cover anything I might need in the coming days. I wasn't sure where I was going to stay yet, but I knew one thing for sure: I wasn't going to spend another night under the same roof as her. After leaving the bank, I made my way to a storage unit facility and rented a small space. I wasn't going to give Emily the satisfaction of taking her time moving out, dragging this out with excuses and delays. If she wasn't gone by tonight, I would pack her things myself and dump them in storage. By the time I got back to the house, the sun was starting to set, casting a dull glow over the driveway. I parked and sat in the car for a moment, watching the house through the windshield. It looked the same as it always had, but I knew it never would be again. When I walked inside, the first thing I noticed was the packed suitcase sitting by the front door. Emily was on the couch, her eyes red and swollen, clutching a tissue in her hands. She looked up the second I stepped in, her face filled with something between hope and fear. "I packed," she said quietly. "But I wanted to see if we could talk first." I closed the door behind me, leaning against it for a moment. "There's nothing left to talk about." Her breath hitched, and she wiped at her eyes quickly. "Steve, please. I know I messed up, I know I hurt you, but don't let this be the end. I'll do anything to fix this." I pushed off the door and crossed my arms. "You don't get to decide when this ends. You already ended it the first time you met him behind my back." Tears slipped down her face, and she reached for me, but I stepped back before she could touch me. "I don't love him," she whispered. "I never did." I let out a slow breath, shaking my head. "Then why did you risk everything for him?" She sucked in a shaky breath, her shoulders trembling. "I was selfish. I thought I could have both." I clenched my jaw, my fingers digging into my arms. "Well, now you have neither." She let out a broken sob, covering her mouth with her hands, her entire body shaking as she cried. I watched her, feeling nothing but emptiness. No anger, no sadness, just the realization that this was the woman I had wasted 12 years of my life on. She looked up at me, desperation clear in her expression. "Where am I supposed to go?" I shrugged. "Not my problem." Her eyes widened slightly, as if she couldn't believe I would be so cold. But what did she expect? For me to comfort her? For me to tell her that everything would be okay? I had nothing left to give her. She wiped her face, letting out a shaky breath. "I'll go," she said finally, her voice barely audible. I nodded once, stepping aside so she could grab her suitcase. She hesitated for a moment, like she was waiting for me to stop her, to change my mind. When I didn't, she slowly walked past me, pulling the door open. She turned back one last time, her face crumbling. "I'm sorry." I met her gaze, my expression unreadable. Too late. Then she stepped outside, and I closed the door behind her. I stood there for a long moment after closing the door, staring at the spot where Emily had just been. The silence in the house was heavier than it had ever been, pressing down on me like a weight I hadn't realized I'd been carrying for months. She was gone. Just like that. No more lies, no more empty promises, no more of her walking through that door pretending everything was fine while sneaking behind my back. I should have felt relief. I should have felt something. Instead, there was just a numbness, a strange emptiness that settled in my chest. I walked toward the couch, sitting down heavily, letting my head rest against the back of it as I exhaled slowly. The house felt too big now, too quiet. Every little sound, cars passing outside, the hum of the refrigerator, the creak of the floorboards, felt like an intrusion. For the first time in 12 years, I was alone, really alone, and it wasn't the way I had imagined it. It wasn't freedom. It wasn't peace. It was just nothing. I sat there for what felt like hours, staring at the ceiling, letting my thoughts run in circles until my phone buzzed on the table beside me. I glanced at it, expecting another message from Emily, another desperate attempt to get me to talk, but it wasn't her. It was a name I hadn't seen in a long time. "Jason, heard what happened. You good?" Jason and I had been friends since college, but life had pulled us in different directions over the years. We still kept in touch, still grabbed a drink every now and then, but he had moved out of state a while back, and we hadn't talked as much lately. If he was reaching out now, it meant the news had already started spreading. I stared at the message for a second before typing a response.
Me, I'm fine.
A few seconds later, my phone buzzed again.
Jason, no, you're not. Want to talk?
I let out a breath, rubbing a hand over my face.
Me, not right now. Maybe later.
He didn't push, just sent a simple alright.
Call me if you need to.
I put my phone back down, leaning forward, resting my elbows on my knees. The worst part wasn't the betrayal itself. It was knowing that everyone else would know. That people would talk, that friends and family would look at me with pity, that Emily would spin her own version of the story to make herself seem less guilty.
That was something I couldn't let happen.
I grabbed my phone again, scrolling through my contacts until I found the name I was looking for.
Anna. Anna was Emily's best friend.
At least, she had been before Emily started pushing people away while sneaking around behind my back. Anna had always been suspicious of Emily's behavior, always dropping hints that something wasn't right, but I had ignored them. I had been too trusting, too blind.
Not anymore. I hit call and waited.
She picked up on the second ring.
Steve? Yeah, I said, my voice steady. I assume you heard.
There was a pause, then a sigh. I had a feeling something was going on, but I didn't know for sure.
Emily's been different for a while. Different, I repeated, shaking my head. That's a nice way to put it. Another pause. I'm sorry. You didn't deserve this. I let out a short breath. No, I didn't.
There was silence for a few seconds before she spoke again, her tone cautious.
Why are you calling me?
I leaned back against the couch, glancing toward the door.
Because I know how this is going to go.
Emily's going to tell her version of the story, and she's going to twist it in a way that makes her look like the innocent.
I'm not letting that happen. Anna was quiet for a moment. Then, what do you want me to do?
I hesitated, choosing my words carefully. You're still in touch with most of our friends.
I just need the truth out there.
I don't need to trash her.
I don't need to exaggerate anything. I just need people to know what actually happened. She let out a slow breath. You know she's going to hate you for this, right? I let out a dry laugh.
She already does.
Anna was silent for a moment before she said, okay. I'll talk to people. But Steve, what are you going to do now? I exhaled, closing my eyes briefly. I don't know yet.
She didn't push, just gave a soft "take care of yourself," before hanging up. I sat there for a while longer before finally standing up, stretching my stiff muscles.
I needed to get out of the house.
Sitting here, drowning in my own thoughts, wasn't going to do me any good.
I grabbed my keys and headed for the door. The first stop was the storage unit.
I had told Emily to pack her things, but I wasn't stupid enough to believe she would take everything. I needed to make sure whatever was left behind was out of my house as soon as possible. When I got there, I opened the unit, staring at the empty space that would soon be filled with the remains of a marriage that no longer existed. It was pathetic, really. 12 years together, and all it amounted to was a pile of belongings in a rented space. I left the unit and drove around for a while, ending up at a bar I hadn't been to in years. It wasn't packed, just a few scattered groups of people talking and laughing, oblivious to the fact that my life had just fallen apart. I walked to the counter, ordered a drink, and sat down, letting the familiar burn of whiskey settle in my throat. For the first time since this all started, I let myself feel it. The anger, the betrayal, the loss. I wasn't just losing a wife. I was losing a life I had built, a future I had planned. And now, I had to start over, whether I was ready or not. I took another sip, letting the alcohol dull the sharp edges of my thoughts.
This wasn't the end. Not for me.
Emily had made her choices, and now, I was making mine.